in the old city of Batavia, now known as Jakarta. The year 1648 marked a turning point. The air was thick with the scent of spices and the sound of distant waves, but beneath this veneer of tranquility, a storm was brewing. Governor-General Cornelis van der Leen, a man of stern authority, made a decision that would reshape the lives of many. He began to pull the diaconate, the group responsible for poor relief, away from the consistory, the religious body that governed the church. This move was not just bureaucratic. It was a seismic shift in the power dynamics of the colony. The diaconate, once a part of the church, now had to meet separately and answer directly to the Politiek Raad, the political council of Batavia. This change was not well received by the ministers and elders, who saw it as a breach of ecclesiastical authority. But the deacons, the men and women responsible for helping the poor, approved of the transition. They saw it as an opportunity to gain more independence and work more closely with the colonial authorities. As the years passed, the gap between the consistory and the diaconate grew wider. Governor-General John Metsujaker, who took office in the 1650s, further solidified this separation. The deacons now managed their own affairs, opening their financial records to the consistory for only 1 day a year. They conferred with the consistory, but their actions were increasingly independent. This shift was not without conflict. Ministers saw it as a serious violation of church orders, but the deacons believed they were on equal footing with the consistory, and even demanded a role in the election of elders. The changes in Batavia were not isolated. When the Dutch East India Company, BOC, expanded to other colonies like Malacca, Ceylon, and South Africa, the structure of the diaconate in Batavia served as a model. In Malacca, deacons provided relief to all needy residents, regardless of their religious beliefs. They loaned money and functioned as the Dutch government's welfare agency. In Ceylon, Governor Adrian van der Meyden received instructions from Metsujaker to ensure the deacons operated independently of the clergy. The instructions were clear. The deacons should be chosen by the colonial government and have no authority over them. At the Cape of Good Hope, the company established a relief fund for free burghers before the formation of a consistory or diaconate. The first settlers arrived in 1657, and the governor quickly organized a support system to help them survive in the harsh new land. The first, predicant Beham van Arkel, formed a consistory in 1665, which then selected a deacon to manage poor relief. The diaconate took on the responsibility for all provision, working under the control of company administrators. The diaconate in these colonies became a welfare agency, providing outdoor relief to those in need and supervising the colonial orphanage. The consistory retained the right to nominate candidates, but the governor made the final selection. The number of deacons remained small, with 4 in Cape Town and 1 or 2 in Drakenstein and Stellenbosch. The funds came from church collections, testaments, gifts, and legal fees. The primary function of the deacons was to support the poorest members of society, often the victims of the Dutch colonial enterprise. Native widows and orphans, left by European men, were a persistent form of poverty. In 1667, the governor of Ceylon cited this problem as a reason to reorganize relief measures. Women often received a regular dole until they remarried, and orphans received more direct institutional support. In Batavia, the diaconate managed an orphanage that housed between 80 and 100 children, providing them with religious instruction and vocational training. Manumitted slaves, freed from bondage but with few resources, also became the responsibility of the diaconate. Christian slaves received some privileges, such as permission to marry and a minimal education, making them a target for conversion. In Cape Town, over 2,000 slaves were baptized between 1665 and 1795. Deacons in Batavia and Cape Town complained to colonial authorities about the increasing number of ex-slaves, leading to financial requirements for manumission. In 1708, owners in Cape Town had to seek government approval to ensure a freed slave could provide for themselves. By 1777, the fee for manumission was raised to 50 rix dollars, and in 1783, owners had to purchase a 20-year bond. The diaconate evolved from a religious charitable institution into a colonial welfare agency, reflecting the changing nature of the Dutch Empire. As the VOC expanded, the deacons adapted to the needs of the colonies, providing relief to the most vulnerable while supporting the company's commercial interests. These changes were not just administrative, they were a reflection of the complex and often cruel realities of colonial life. The diaconate, once a part of the church, became a tool of the colonial state, tasked with managing the human fallout of the Dutch Empire's expansion. The Dutch and their involvement in the slave trade is a complex and often misunderstood story. Historians have long debated the attitudes of Dutch Calvinists toward slavery, especially before and after the Dutch conquests of the Banda Islands in 1621 and Brazil in 1630. Many believe that Calvinists were initially opposed to slavery, but later justified it as a more humane practice compared to that of the Spanish and Portuguese. However, the evidence suggests a more nuanced and ambivalent attitude. Dutch Calvinists often saw themselves as the modern-day Israelites, guided by the Mosaic Law and the prophetic tradition. They believed that the world was corrupted by sin, leading to brutalities like slavery. While they might have opposed slavery in principle within the Dutch Republic, they generally accepted it as a necessary evil in non-Christian lands. This perspective allowed them to adapt to existing networks of slavery and slave trading as they expanded their overseas empire. One example of this ambivalence is the case of Festus Homius, a Calvinist minister in Leiden. Sometimes cited as an opponent of slavery, Homius's writings on the topic are actually quite ambiguous. He condemned man-stealing, based on Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, which states that kidnapping and selling a person is punishable by death. However, this was a legal maxim, not a clear moral stance against slavery itself. Homius's other writings on slavery were equally vague, and he did not offer a strong opposition to the practice. When Dutch ministers arrived in places like Batavia, modern-day Jacta, they encountered a world of slaveholding that they were unprepared for. In 1629, the ministers and elders in Batavia received a letter from their colleagues in Zeeland criticizing the practice of slaveholding in the Indies. The Batavian ministers did not respond, indicating a lack of strong opposition. 2 years later, Justus Hernius criticized Johan du Preit for buying and reselling slaves for profit. But his concern was more about the church's reputation than the morality of slave trading itself. The Dutch conquests of the Banda Islands in 1605 and Brazil in 1630 marked a significant shift. These territories were rich in cloves and sugar, and the Dutch needed cheap labor to exploit these resources. The East India Company, VOC, and the West India Company, WIC, began to actively engage in the slave trade. The WIC initially shunned the slave trade, but changed its course after the conquest of Brazil. By 1636, the Dutch were transporting thousands of enslaved Africans to Brazil and other colonies. Between 1630 and 1651, over 31,500 enslaved Africans were transported to Brazil alone. The Dutch became the leading slave traders in the Atlantic during several periods in the 17th century. In the Indian Ocean, the VOC also integrated existing slave trading networks. They used slave labor for various tasks, including ship, repair, and agriculture. Batavia, the headquarters of the VOC, had the largest number of slaves, with over 16,000 slaves in 1679. The slave trade in the Indian Ocean was less focused on plantation agriculture, but still significant. The participation in the slave trade sparked discussions among Dutch theologians and intellectuals. Hugo Grotius, a prominent Dutch jurist, wrote The Law of War and Peace in 1625, in which he argued that while slavery was not natural, it could be justified under certain conditions, such as war or debt. Grotius's ideas became influential, and many Dutch Calvinists used them to justify their involvement in the slave trade. Dutch Calvinists believed that their form of slavery was more humane and offered slaves better chances of salvation. They argued that Christian slave owners should treat their slaves well and not sell them to non-Christians. Some Calvinists, like Gisbertus Voetius and Jacob Hondius, opposed slavery, but their views were in the minority. Even a former slave, Jacobus, Elisa, Joannes Capitine, who converted to Calvinism and became a minister, defended slavery in his dissertation, arguing that the soul remains free regardless of the body's condition. Despite some opposition, most Dutch Calvinists did not seriously challenge the principle of enslavement. Many ministers and theologians gave implicit or explicit approval to slavery, either by remaining silent or by owning slaves themselves. The Reformed Church's mission to convert slaves was part of this framework. Ministers in the East Indies and South Africa instructed slaves in the Christian faith and baptized them, which sometimes led to better treatment and a chance at manumission. In Batavia, for example, the consistory encouraged slave owners to bring their slaves to church and catechism classes. By 1648, baptized slaves were allowed to take communion if they met certain requirements. In South Africa, the Reformed Church achieved significant success in converting slaves. Between 1665 and 1779, over 2,000 slaves were baptized, most of whom were owned by the VOC. This chapter reveals the complex and often contradictory attitudes of Dutch Calvinists toward slavery. While some opposed it, many others accepted it as a necessary part of their overseas empire, justifying it to religious and moral arguments. The Dutch involvement in the slave trade had a profound impact on their colonies and the lives of countless enslaved individuals. The Batavian Church Order of 1643 was a groundbreaking document for European Protestant churches. It outlined a plan to convert non-Christians to the Reformed faith. One key point in this plan was that new converts should behave like the Dutch. However, this was a bit confusing, as the Dutch overseas were known more for fighting, drinking, and licentious behavior than for pious living. This directive revealed the challenges church leaders faced in adapting Protestant Christianity to the lives of people in colonial settings. They assumed that converts should act like Reformed church members in Europe, but the reality was much more complex. In the early years of the Dutch mission project, clergy in the Empire and in the Netherlands struggled to define how Protestant Christianity should fit into the lives of people raised outside Christendom. They were part of a global movement of proselytization during the early modern period, where Christian missionaries and Muslim divines worked to convert or purify people's religious practices. The Dutch Calvinist mission, though smaller in scope, was part of this worldwide effort. Despite this, older scholarship often portrayed Calvinist missionaries as indifferent or ineffective compared to their Catholic counterparts. However, recent studies show that Dutch Calvinists did engage in significant missionary work, facing similar challenges to those of Catholic priests and Muslim scholars. Calvinists abroad and at home were optimistic about winning converts. They believed that God would call many non-Christians to salvation. This optimism was reflected in the writings of early supporters and ministers. However, the reality was more challenging. Natives often showed little interest in Protestant Christianity, and the language of conversion often seemed more like a hope for a grand crusade than a practical plan. The Reformed approach to conversion was centered on community formation. Calvinists sought to build tightly knit congregations based on preaching, administering sacraments, and implementing moral discipline. Unlike in the Roman Catholic Church, membership in the Dutch Reformed Church was voluntary. Adults had to demonstrate knowledge of Reformed doctrine, show evidence of a good lifestyle, and submit to the discipline of the Church. Baptism was the initiation rite, marking one's entry into the religious community. It was seen as a sign of the covenantal relationship between God and His people, similar to circumcision in the Old Testament. Baptism was closely linked to taking communion, or the Lord's Supper. To partake in communion for the first time, baptized adults had to undergo an examination to show they understood Reformed teachings. They also had to give their assent to these teachings and agree to follow the Church's discipline. Only then could they take communion. The communion service was a central part of uniting the community in worship, symbolizing the purity and unity of the believers. The mission evolved over time, facing various problems. Calvinists and native converts encountered significant challenges in adapting the Reformed faith to different cultural contexts. For example, in Brazil, most plantations were owned by Portuguese or Criollo planters, who were Catholic and resistant to Protestant conversion. In Suriname and the Caribbean, Protestant plantation owners resisted efforts to convert their slaves, seeing it as a threat to their control over labor. Even when some slaves were baptized, many ministers became skeptical of their motives, fearing they were seeking better treatment or manumission. In the colonies, the church deacons were often left to deal with the social issues stemming from colonial society, such as manumitted slaves, abandoned women, widows, and orphans. To make the diaconate more effective, VOC governors in the mid-1600s had to adapt it significantly, turning it into a colonial welfare agency. Despite these challenges, the Dutch Calvinist mission continued to evolve. Ministers and theologians grappled with questions of faith, affiliation, and religious identity. They debated what constituted proper Christian practice and how to handle converts who continued their old ways. These discussions were ongoing, reflecting the intractable problems of converting people across cultural boundaries. The struggles of Dutch Calvinists overseas provide valuable insights into the complexities of spreading Christianity in the early modern world. The Sunday service was the heart of Calvinist worship. It was a day set aside for rest and reflection, a time to gather in the church and listen to the Word of God. Calvinists believed that Sunday was the Christian Sabbath, a holy day meant for worship and abstaining from work. The sermons delivered on this day were not just talks, but powerful tools for teaching, guiding, and converting people to the Christian faith. These sermons explained the Bible in a way that helped people understand their moral duties and deepen their devotion to God. In the Netherlands during the 17th century, many people who attended Reformed church services were not official members. They were known as hearers or sympathizers. These individuals would come to church, listen to the sermons, and sometimes even participate in church activities. But they hadn't made a formal commitment to the Reformed faith. They didn't take communion and weren't subject to the church's discipline. The term hearer suggested someone who passively listened to the word, while sympathizer indicated someone who was interested in the faith but hadn't fully committed yet. This distinction was important because it showed that Calvinists saw conversion as a journey, not an instant event. They recognized that people were at different stages in their spiritual paths and welcomed them into the church community regardless of where they were on that journey. Calvinist ministers focused on building communities based on shared beliefs, behaviors, and commitments. They believed that conversion was a process of growing in understanding and practicing the Christian faith. In the Dutch colonies, the approach to conversion was slightly different. The formation of a consistory, a group of church leaders who oversaw the administration of the sacraments and maintained church discipline, was a crucial step in establishing a reformed Christian community. For example, in the East Indies, ministers like Hulspoes and Melchior Zoon worked with the governor of Banda to set up a consistory to ensure that the sacraments were administered properly and that the community remained pure. They believed that by setting a good example, they could attract more people to the Christian faith. One notable exception to this approach was the mission in Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. Here, the Dutch governor, Pieter Knights, and the ministers, George Candidius and Robert Junius, adopted a more aggressive strategy. They preached and taught in the local language, offered military protection to those who converted, and baptized almost anyone who showed interest. This approach led to a significant number of converts, with over 5,000 people baptized by 1643. However, this method was controversial among Calvinist ministers, who worried that it might compromise the purity of the faith. In other parts of the Dutch Empire, such as Batavia, the Moluccan Islands, and Brazil, Reformed ministers focused on building communities of believers. They set up schools, proselytized, and worked to convert people who had little to no exposure to Christianity. This included Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and even Sephardic Jews. The first step in conversion was to ensure that prospective converts had a basic understanding of the faith, including the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. They also had to demonstrate a commitment to living a Christian life, which meant following Christian customs and avoiding immoral behavior. However, the process of conversion was often complicated. For example, in Batavia, ministers were concerned that newly baptized converts might revert to their old religious practices. To prevent this, they required additional education and a demonstration of maturity in the faith before allowing converts to take communion. This practice, known as dividing the sacraments, was criticized by some in the Netherlands for violating the unity of baptism and communion. The Calvinist vision for their overseas territories was to create Christian societies, or spiritual Jerusalems, where Christian values and practices were the norm. This involved changing how people worshipped, altering the landscape to remove pagan and Catholic symbols, and redefining the way people used their time. One of the most important aspects of this transformation was the observance of Sunday as a day of rest and worship. Calvinists lobbied political authorities to enforce Sabbath laws, ensuring that everyone, including non-Christians, would have the opportunity to rest and worship. Despite these efforts, enforcing Sabbath observance was a challenge. Many people, including company officers, did not always comply with the laws. However, the goal was clear: to create a society where the Christian faith was at the center of daily life, and where the teachings of the Bible guided the actions of all its members. The push to make Sundays a day of rest and worship was a key part of the effort to spread Christianity in places where pagan and Muslim practices were common. For the Calvinists, keeping Sunday sacred wasn't just about going to church. It was about creating a day when people could focus on God, pray, and reflect on their faith. By making everyone observe the Sabbath, they were trying to reshape how people thought about time, making it align with their Christian beliefs. In the colonies, this meant that the Sabbath was seen as a time when all work and play should stop. Calvinists used strong words to describe what they saw as violations of the Sabbath. Working or playing on Sunday was called profaning the Sabbath, which meant that these actions were seen as disrespectful and even harmful to the community's spiritual health. This focus on the Sabbath was part of a larger plan to transform the religious landscape of the colonies. Wherever the Dutch established control, Calvinist missionaries followed, aiming to create a society that reflected Reformed Protestant values. They believed that false religions, like Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism, were deeply rooted in the hearts of the local people and were hard to remove. Calvinist leaders, from theologians like Voetius and Hornbeck to ministers in the field, were worried that these religions would pull converts back into their old ways. In places like Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, the Dutch feared that Buddhist temples and Hindu shrines would keep people from fully embracing Christianity. The Colombo Consistory, for example, argued that the long history of heathenism on the island made it hard for true Christianity to take root. They saw Buddhist pagodas as a threat to Christian education and pushed for their destruction. In Brazil, the Dutch were particularly frustrated by the open practice of Catholicism. While in other colonies, Catholic priests worked in secret. In Brazil, they were allowed to conduct public processions and hold masses. Calvinist ministers were outraged by this and pressured the governor, Moritz, to restrict Catholic activities. In 1640, Moritz expelled Catholic religious orders, but the struggle continued even after he left. In Batavia, now Jakarta, the Dutch tried to ban all false religions, including Islam and Buddhism. Governor-generals starting in 1643 made it illegal to practice these religions, but they often gave local people some leeway. For example, they banned circumcision to prevent boys from becoming Muslims, but they didn't always enforce the ban strictly. The consistory in Batavia was very strict about this, and often clashed with the governor over the presence of mosques and temples. Despite the consistory's efforts by the late 17th century, Muslim communities in Batavia were largely self-governing and practiced their faith openly. The Calvinists were especially concerned about rituals and celebrations that involved images, dancing, and other symbols they saw as idolatrous. In Batavia, the consistory targeted Chinese street theater, New Year's Eve celebrations, and temple worship. These activities were seen as a threat to the Christian community, and the colonial government eventually began to regulate them. Sometimes, church officials took matters into their own hands. In one case, a missionary in the East Indies destroyed altars he found in a village. In Ceylon, the presence of Buddhist temples, especially the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy, was a major concern. The temple was a significant pilgrimage site, and the Dutch feared it would draw converts back to Buddhism. They tried to get the company to take action, but the directors were more concerned with maintaining good relations with local rulers. The Calvinists also opposed the public presence of other Protestant groups, like the Moravians and Lutherans. They argued that the Reformed Church had exclusive rights to spread the faith and that introducing other denominations would confuse the local people and damage their mission. Overall, the Calvinists used a combination of preaching and education to spread their faith. They set up schools to teach the basics of the Reformed religion and sent ministers to preach in local languages. Despite the challenges, they remained committed to their goal of converting colonial societies to Christianity. Preaching was a big deal in Calvinist communities. It was one of the key ways the Word of God was shared, and only ordained ministers were allowed to give sermons. In 1677, the Batavian consistory said that preaching was how God's Word was spread, so ministers should preach as much as they could. The Dutch Reformed Church made sure pastors had a lot of theological training, but until the 1640s, ministers sent overseas didn't get much preparation cultures. In the early 1620s, Antonius Walaeus started a seminary for overseas ministers at the University of Leiden, but it closed after 10 years. Later in the 1630s, universities in Utrecht and Leiden began focusing on training students for overseas work. Calvinists believed that a strong understanding of Christianity and the Holy Spirit's power were enough to preach effectively to people who didn't know about Christianity. By the second half of the 1600s, Calvinist preachers started studying other religions more deeply. They saw both connections and differences between Christianity and other faiths. For example, Francis Curran, a minister in Amboina, wrote sermons that were popular for use by local church workers. Reformed writers following St. Paul believed that everyone has some knowledge of God, even if they don't seem religious. But original sin had led people to worship created things instead of God, leading to false religions. Johannes Hornbeck, a theologian in the Netherlands, talked about how Hindu practices like cleansing sins in the Ganges River and revering the Vedas were distorted attempts to find what the Christian gospel offered. Preachers were taught to start with common beliefs and then lead people to the core teachings of Christianity, such as the nature of man, the fall from grace, and Christ's role as Savior. When preaching to Muslims, Calvinists used an apologetic approach, focusing on the Bible to challenge the authority of the Quran. Gisbertus Voius, another theologian, advised his students to show how the Quran derived from the Bible but twisted its teachings. He also encouraged ministers to study the Quran to find contradictions with the Bible and natural law. Adrian Reland, an expert on Islam, suggested that ministers should recognize the shared teachings between Islam and Christianity and use those as a starting point for discussions. While preaching was crucial, educating young people was another important strategy for spreading Calvinism in colonial areas. In 1637, Dutch authorities in Formosa reported that Robert Junius's efforts to teach Christianity were opening the eyes of the locals. The Dutch East India Company, BOC, and the Dutch West India Company, WIC, set up many schools in their colonies to teach religion and language. The VOC's governing body, the 17 gentlemen, ordered governors to establish schools to spread Christianity and promote civilization among non-Christian peoples. The Batavian Church Order of 1643 gave specific guidelines for schoolmasters. They were to teach children to fear God, pray, sing, and attend church, to be obedient to parents, authorities, and masters, to read, write, and do arithmetic, to have good morals and manners in school. These schools reached tens of thousands of children with Reformed teachings. Indigenous teachers often ran the schools, which were funded by the trading companies. By the 1680s, there were 54 schools in the East Indies, with over 5,000 students. In Ceylon, there were about 30 schools in the 1660s, with 18,000 students. In Formosa, the Dutch and Church worked together to build several schools in the 1630s, and by 1643 there were 50 native teachers leading 600 students. In the Cape of Good Hope, schools appeared in the early 1700s, and the Church supervised religious instruction for slaves, free settlers, and company employees. The WIC also set up schools in the Atlantic colonies, including New Netherland, Brazil, Curaçao, and the Gold Coast. The first school in New Netherland opened in 1637 or 1638, and by the end of Dutch rule, there were schools in several settlements. The Dutch East and West India companies paid teachers and provided educational materials. Ministers and colonial authorities worked together to manage the schools, with ministers visiting to inspect the quality of instruction and the progress of students. These visits were supposed to happen regularly, but sometimes they were delayed due to sickness, political instability, or other issues. Indigenous teachers played a crucial role in the schools. Despite the Dutch language policy, local teachers were often needed to teach in the vernacular languages. In Ceylon, the VOC replaced Catholic priests with local young men who could teach and do administrative tasks. Philip Aldeus worked in the Jaffna-Patnam region to train teachers and translate instructional materials into Tamil. The most ambitious training program for indigenous teachers was in Ceylon, where the VOC opened a seminary in Nallur in 1696 and another in Colombo in 1696. These schools and seminaries were essential for spreading the Reformed faith in the Dutch colonies. They helped convert many people and laid the foundation for a lasting Christian presence in these regions. In the East Indies, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, recognized the importance of local teachers in spreading their religious and educational goals. They trained native teachers, often informally, to help with educating the local population. In places like Amboina, the Dutch schoolmasters were gradually replaced by indigenous leaders by the 1620s and 1630s. In Batavia and the Moluccan Islands, early ministers like Sebastian Dankeherds and Justus Hernias worked closely with native teachers, teaching them Christian beliefs, reading and writing. Dutch religious leaders and lay readers also played a role in training local schoolmasters. Despite efforts to teach the Dutch language, it remained challenging to make it the primary language of instruction. Instead, Portuguese and Malay continued to be widely used in schools. By the later part of the 17th century, more structured forms of teacher education began to emerge. For example, in Batavia, the Latin school was established in 1642, but had a short lifespan, reopening a few times before finally closing in 1755. This school produced a few ministers and teachers. In Batavia, local catechism teachers who gave lessons in homes and neighborhoods became more common, with 34 such teachers by 1706. The Amboina Church Order of 1673 required native teachers in remote areas to attend classes and take exams in the city every few weeks. In other regions, the use of native schoolmasters was less effective. In Formosa and Brazil, the Dutch clergy and governors struggled to find and train local teachers. In Formosa, despite a surge in conversions in the 1630s, the lack of clerical oversight and linguistic barriers hindered the development of a reliable network of native schoolmasters. A seminary in Sulang, Formosa, was established in 1657, but was short-lived due to the expulsion of the Dutch by Chinese forces led by Plestis Chungong, Coxinga, in 1662. In Brazil, the search for Portuguese-speaking indigenous teachers yielded limited results. At the Cape of Good Hope, the Dutch did not use native schoolmasters at all. Instead, they relied on company soldiers and other methods to teach the local population. The Dutch recognized that the success of their global Calvinist mission depended heavily on the quality of native teachers. Inspectors often linked the industry and piety of a schoolmaster directly to the progress of students in the Reformed faith. For example, the Colombo Consistory in 1683 credited schoolmasters with helping to convert people from paganism to Christianity and from concubinage to Christian marriage. In Amboina, the minister Francis Caran praised the teachers in Hatala and Keeling for their hard work and the good performance of their students, which gave parents confidence to send their children to school. Similarly, in Sapa, Sarum, the minister Pieter Durant commended a schoolmaster for producing excellent students. However, when religious education failed, native schoolmasters often took the blame. Ministers like Pieter Newton Ternate explained in 1703 that students would only understand the religion if their schoolmaster did. He believed that the ignorance of teachers in North Sulawesi led to a lack of Christianity in many areas. Dutch inspectors often criticized native teachers for lack of discipline, insolence, and drunkenness, which they said kept parents from sending their children to school. For example, in 1674, inspectors complained about a teacher in Akun, Nusa Laut, whose anger and vindictiveness kept children away from the classroom. In 1675, another inspector described a teacher in Bagwala, Ambon, as insolent and drunk, discouraging parents from sending their children to school. The Dutch also criticized native teachers for being apathetic and lazy. Inspectors often typecast teachers as uninterested and conniving. For instance, in 1720, a schoolmaster in Nottingola was reported to live like a heathen, spending most of his time in the forest and gardens. Nicholas Verburg, the governor of Formosa in 1654, described the teaching corps there as unprofitable servants who lack all Christian virtues and are of no possible use in converting the heathen. These criticisms reflected the ministers' frustration and their realization that the success of their mission depended on the native teachers. Despite these criticisms, many schools functioned reasonably well. Local teachers often had to work additional jobs to supplement their low pay, which sometimes led to absences from school. However, the bitter complaints from ministers often stemmed from their own cultural disconnect and the realization that the progress of global Calvinism rested on the shoulders of native teachers. Schools used a variety of religious materials, including catechisms, sermons, and devotional texts, to teach the basic tenets of Orthodox Calvinism. While parts of the Bible were translated, the full translation of the Bible did not begin in earnest until the second half of the 1600s. To encourage parents to send their children to school, the VOC used a mix of compulsion and compensation. School days in the East Indies typically lasted 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, with a break in between. On Wednesdays and Saturdays, students attended only in the morning. Since parents relied on their children's labor, the company provided incentives like rice to families whose children attended school. For example, families in Banda received 20 pounds of rice per month. In Brazil, the WIC was pressed to subsidize students for Christian education. In Ceylon and Formosa, school attendance was compulsory for Christians, but enforcement was difficult. When the requirement was dropped in Ceylon in 1751, attendance dropped significantly. In Formosa, children attended school 5 days a week, and those who attended regularly received rice, while those who did not were fined. In the Cape of Good Hope, compulsory schooling for the Khoi people was impractical due to their migratory patterns and hostility to Dutch rule. The Calvinist mission to convert people within the Dutch Empire evolved through 3 phases. The initial phase, from the 1610s to the late 1640s, was marked by the first face-to-face encounters between ministers and people of other religions. Calvinist clergy held Islam and other non-European religions in contempt, viewing them as forms of paganism characterized by idol worship and sexual disorder. Ministers in the East Indies, Ceylon, Formosa, and Brazil felt a profound sense of estrangement from the local populations. By the mid-17th century, the mission entered a second phase characterized by a more academic approach to studying other religions. Scholars in the Netherlands and clergy in the Empire began to take a more serious interest in understanding Islam and local religions. Gerardus Vossius and Johannes Hornbeck wrote extensively on paganism, and Hornbeck emphasized the importance of academic methods in converting non-Christians. Gisbertus Voetius and his colleagues at Utrecht and Leiden prepared ministers to engage with Islam more effectively. This academic emphasis led to renewed attention to educating native teachers and increased efforts to translate scriptural texts. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, seminaries in Nallur and Colombo became the most successful institutions for training native teachers and proponents of Reformed theology. The Colombo Seminary, supported by a printing press established by Governor Gustav Willem van Imhoff, produced a wealth of religious literature. Ministers also contributed to a more nuanced understanding of Hinduism, Buddhism, and the religious landscape of Southeast Asia. Treatises by Abraham, Rogerius, Philip Baldaeus, and François Valentin provided detailed accounts of local customs and practices, reflecting a more systematic and nuanced perception of the diverse religious environments. The journey of spreading the Christian faith in places like Ceylon and the East Indies was a complex and evolving story. At the start, Dutch missionaries brought with them books of prayers, catechisms, and sermons, mostly in Portuguese and Malay. But as time went on, they realized the importance of reaching people in their own languages, like Tamil and Sinhalese. This led to a big push in the 1600s to translate more of the Bible into these languages. The goal was to show Muslims in particular that the Bible was the true Word of God, as they were very devoted to the Quran and hard to convert. One of the key figures in this effort was a man named Hieronius, who in the 1640s and 1650s worked on translating parts of the New Testament into Malay. Later, in 1662, Daniel Brouwerius completed the Book of Genesis and the New Testament in Malay. Many other missionaries followed, and by the end of the 1600s, the entire Bible was translated into a form of Malay used by educated Muslims. In Ceylon, it took longer. But by the mid-1700s, the Gospels were available in Sinhalese and the New Testament in Tamil. However, the mission faced many challenges. By the 1720s and 1730s, the mission work had entered a new phase. The Dutch consistory in Batavia, the main city in the East Indies, noticed that the church's influence was waning, and they blamed the shortage of ministers and teachers. Despite this, the church continued to grow, especially in Batavia and Amboina. But the growth was slow, and the number of new converts remained low. The church kept track of baptisms, marriages, and new communicants, but these records often felt routine and lacked the excitement of the earlier years. Over time, the missionaries developed a more nuanced understanding of the local religions. For example, Valentine, a missionary in the East Indies, was critical of Islam but also recognized the piety and hard work of some Muslims. He even described a personal encounter where he observed Muslim prayers and had a deep conversation with a Muslim priest. He also wrote about Buddhism and Hinduism in Ceylon, noting the rich religious literature of these traditions and even including some moral lessons from Hindu and Buddhist writers. By the mid-1700s, the consistory in Colombo, Ceylon, began to rethink their strict stance against other religions. They realized that people were deeply attached to their own beliefs, and that being too harsh only made them more resistant. This shift showed a more flexible approach to cultural differences, moving away from the earlier view that all non-Christian beliefs were evil. The church also used numbers to track its progress. They counted converts, baptisms, and school children, and these reports became more detailed over time. However, the numbers often showed a big difference between full members of the church and nominal Christians, people who were baptized but didn't fully participate in church life. For example, in Colombo, there were over 64,000 nominal Christians, but only 1,000 full members. This pattern was similar in other regions, showing that while many people were baptized, few became fully committed to the church. Despite the challenges, the church continued to add new converts, especially children. In Batavia, the church celebrated when 119 people were baptized in 1 year, and 3 years later, 497 people joined the Christian community. But the standards for becoming a full member were high, and most people, especially non-Europeans, didn't meet them. This story of the Dutch Calvinist mission in the East Indies and Ceylon shows the complexity of spreading a new religion in a different culture. It was a mix of translation, education, and cultural understanding, but it also faced many obstacles. The mission left a lasting impact, but the path to conversion was long and filled with both successes and setbacks.